Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to resume. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we need everyone seated before our program could resume. Please be seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, and Mayor Michael Nutter.
Mayors and ladies and gentlemen, it is, of course, my distinct honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our good friend and my good friend, Vice President Joe Biden. Throughout his career as a public servant, Vice President Biden has championed issues that are critical to the prosperity and growth of America's cities, and he has engaged directly with the U.S. Conference of Mayors on a regular basis. During our annual meeting this past June in Orlando, Vice President Biden pledged that the Obama administration would make sure that future infrastructure investments are more targeted to local areas. In November of last year, the Vice President hosted our leadership in the White House to discuss the fiscal cliff and the concerns of mayors regarding both investment programs and tax-exempt financing. Whenever there is a major issue that demands attention, again and again and again, Vice President Joe Biden has shown the leadership and courage needed to help move our nation in the right direction. And that is why I was certainly very heartened when President Obama asked Vice President Biden to lead a special task force to develop responses to the tragedy at not only Sandy Hook Elementary School, but the daily tragedies we see all across America. The nation's mayors and Vice President Biden have stood together for many, many years in support of public safety. After all, it was then Senator Joe Biden who championed the crime bill, which established the COPS program and included the ban on assault weapons and large-capacity magazines, which Congress unfortunately allowed to expire. Yesterday, I was certainly personally very proud to be in the White House as President Obama and Vice President Biden unveiled a strong, comprehensive package of legislative and regulatory reforms needed to respond to the ongoing gun violence in America's cities and suburbs. Every day, America's mayors see the carnage caused by illegal guns and assault weapons that have no place on our nation's streets. Working with President Obama, Vice President Biden, and the Congress, we will make sure that the changes that are needed to protect our children are made. Ladies and gentlemen of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, please join me in welcoming back our great friend, Vice President Joe Biden.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. Thank you all very, very much. It's an honor to be back with you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging two Delawareans are here that are very engaged in this subject as well. One I've known for years and years, He's now our new mayor, Dennis Williams. Dennis, I don't know where you are out there, but welcome to the conference, old buddy. Great to have you. And Dennis and I go back to the days when we were writing the crime bill, when Dennis was a police officer in the city of Wilmington. And the chief law enforcement of Delaware is here, who I've known even longer. We share the same last name. The Attorney General of the state of Delaware, my son, Bo. And I do whatever he says because he has the power to indict. But all kidding aside, I'm proud of my home state, if you forgive, as we used to say in the Senate, a point of personal privilege, the progress they're making and the efforts they're making under the leadership of Jack Markell, our governor, on the very subject you talked about. And I say to Dennis Williams, Mayor Williams, Dennis, you'll forgive me if occasionally I'm so used to referring to the mayor of Philadelphia as my mayor because I spend about half my life in Philadelphia. And now that my granddaughter resides in the city limits, I want to be particularly good. My daughter's also a voter there as well, so I've got to be particularly on good behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be back. I look forward to this opportunity every chance I get from the time I was a young fellow new to the United States Senate. It's one of the groups with whom I've had a relationship for a long, long time, and it's always nice to be with a group of people who you agree with on 80% of the issues 90% of the time. So it's nice to be with you. I know you've come to talk about a broad range of very important, challenging issues that are facing each of your cities and towns. Energy, infrastructure, budgets, finances, crime. And I want you to know that we, the President and I, and the important part of that is the President, continues to be absolutely committed to do all we can to help the cities deal with the immense problems that get thrust upon them as a consequence of diminished tax bases, as a consequence of housing a significant portion of the public in their states that are in the most need. We're committed to having a third phase of the so-called big deal in the budget. We're of the view that just as it took during the Clinton administration, it didn't happen in one fell swoop to get our economy in great shape and move toward a balanced budget. It started off, it was three phases. It started off with President Bush's actions, the first President Bush in terms of taxation before President Clinton took office, then the actions the President took in '94 and then in '97. Well, we think there's a third phase here that can set our country on a path that will allow us to get our debt to GDP, our deficit to GDP down around 3%, which is the basis of which all economists, left, right, and center agree are the areas in which we really can begin to grow as a country. And as my grandfather used to say, with the grace of God and the goodwill of the neighbors, cooler heads will prevail between now and the time we deal with the debt ceiling, that we may very well be able to meet the goal which we set out to do, which is to have roughly a $4 trillion cut over 10 years in the long-term deficit and to put us on that path. But I didn't come here to talk about any of those important subjects today because as important as they all are, today we have a more urgent and immediate call. And that is how to deal with the epidemic of gun violence in America. You all know the statistics better than anyone, so I'm not going to repeat them. On that score, I might add, I owe an incredible debt of gratitude to many of you at the head table, as well as those of you in the room. I know we don't have absolute unanimity in this ballroom, nor do we in any ballroom, but we all know, everyone acknowledges, we have to do something. We have to act, and I hope we all agree there's a need to respond to the carnage on our streets and in our schools. I hope we all agree that mass shootings like the ones that we witnessed in Newtown 34 days ago cannot continue to be tolerated. That tragedy in all my years in public life, I think, has affected the public psyche in a way that I've never seen before. The image of first graders, not only shot, but riddled with bullets. Parents in the streets panicking, trying to find out if the child they put on the bus in the morning had any prospect of getting back on that bus and going home that afternoon. For 20 of those parents, the answer was no. And I believe, as I'm sure you do, that we have an obligation to respond intelligently and to that crisis. And I know many of you feel the same way. I've had the occasion to talk to a number of you, and I wanted to start by thanking all of you, including Mayor Bloomberg, who is not here today, who I spoke to on the phone before he called me. Thank you for your input and your insight. Again, not all agree on what should be done, but you have obviously, probably more than any group of elected officials, thought about this issue more intently and longer. You've done a great deal of work on this, all of you who deal with the issue every day. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'll bet if I did, an awful lot of people would put their hands up in this room. If I were to say, how many of you mayors have had to attend a funeral of a police officer or an innocent child in a drive-by shooting, or a shop owner in your city? Many of you have had to attend, and some of you, too many such funerals. Some of you represent communities that experience mass shootings, not just in schools, but in movie theaters and in temples. And it's not unique to big cities or urban areas, as we now know. It was pure coincidence. I happened to be literally probably turned out to be a quarter of a mile back in 2006 at an outing when I heard gunshots in the woods that we didn't know where we thought they were hunters. As I got back to the clubhouse of this outing and saw helicopters, it was a shooting that had just taken place in a small a small Amish school just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So it's not just big cities or well-to-do suburbs. It can happen anywhere. But I also know that it's not just about mass shootings. As my friend Michael knows, and as my Mayor Dennis William knows in Wilmington, the murder rates in both of our towns are well beyond, and in some of yours, well beyond what's remotely tolerable for a civilized circumstance. It isn't just about mass shootings, it's about gun violence of all kinds. Think of it this way. Over the last several years, about 25 people die of gun-related homicide in this country every single day. Every day. Which is the equivalent of the third most deadly mass shooting in history, happening every 24 hours in this country. As much as we intend on making schools the focus, making them more secure, as Mayor, I don't know whether Ram is here, but as Mayor Emanuel of Chicago said, the truth is, most schools are safe. It's going to and from schools when young people are in the greatest danger. But we don't see that on the news very much anymore. We hear about mass shootings, but not everyday gun violence that's ravaging our cities. I remember my friend, and he really was my friend. I always looked up to him, even though I was considerably senior to him in seniority, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of the finest, brightest guys I've ever known. And when we were trying to get through what was then called the Biden crime bill, it became the Clinton bill, that is what you have all taken great advantage of over the years, we're on the floor debating this issue. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan stood up on the floor and he said, and only he could, he told the story of the Valentine's Day massacre in 1929 and how it shocked the world when 7 gangsters were gunned down in cold blood. It made the front page, according to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, of every major paper in the nation and many around the world. But then he said, looked up, he said, but in 1992, when a woman saved her 3-month-old baby from execution by hiding that baby under the bed. But she was shot and killed, along with her husband and her teenage son. That story, and he took out the New York Times, turned up on the second section, buried in the back of the New York Times. It wasn't front page news. It was barely news at all. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "I call that defining deviancy down." Defining deviancy down. How it wasn't even news. Whereas if that had happened in 1929, it would have been astonishing. Well, folks, we can no longer continue to define deviancy down. We can't wait any longer to take action. The time has come. As you know, this week I delivered a set of recommendations to President Obama on how we can better protect Americans from gun violence. I've been getting both credit and blame for that as if these were original ideas of mine. I want to make it clear what every deputy mayor knows. The only power influence a vice president has is reflective power. None of it matters, no matter what someone tries to give you credit for leadership. But we're not for the leadership of the President of the United States. This is the President of the United States. I am his agent, but this is the President of the United States. And he asked me to go back because I know because of my years of experience in the Judiciary Committee and dealing with these issues. He asked me to go back and do as quick a survey as I could, as thorough as I could in a short time frame, and present him with a set of recommendations. I had the incredible help of some really first-rate cabinet members, starting with our Attorney General, our Secretary of Education, our Secretary of Homeland Security, our Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius. And we met with a range of 229 groups, representing a wide range of perspectives, from members of the law enforcement community, including many from your cities and states, to gun safety advocates, victims of the shootings, both down in Virginia as well as out in Colorado, sportsmen's organizations, hunters, gun owners, the NRA, representatives of the video game and movie industries, educators, retailers, and public health officials. And as I said, I spoke to many of you in this room as well, along with the governors and the county executives. And no group was more consequential or instrumental in shaping of the document we put together for the President than all of you in this room. Through those conversations with you and other stakeholders, after literally hundreds of hours of work and research done by experts at the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and elsewhere, after reviewing just about every idea that had been written up only to gather dust on the shelf of some agency in government, a set of principles emerged that there was not universal agreement on, but overwhelming consensus on. And they were the foundation of the recommendations. If you'll permit me about another 10 to 12 minutes, I want to lay out to you what they are from the perspective of the President and me. The first foundational principle is there is a Second Amendment. The President and I support the Second Amendment. And it comes with the right of law-abiding, responsible citizens to own guns, use it for their protection as well as for recreation. The second foundational principle, certain people in society should not and legally can be disqualified from being able to own a gun because they are unstable or they are dangerous. They are not the citizens that, in fact, the vast majority of gun owners comprise. 3, we should make common sense judgments about keeping dangerous weapons off our streets, clearly within the purview of the government, at the same time recognizing, honoring, and being compliant with the Second Amendment. And 4, this isn't just about guns. It's about the coursing of our culture. Yes, that's what I said, the coursing of our culture, whether it's with video games or movies or behavior. It's about the ability to access mental health services and the safety of our schools. It's a very complex problem, and it requires a complex solution. Based on these principles and the input of a vast array of groups and experts, we put together a comprehensive plan based on a common sense approach, where I believe, from heading up this group, there really is overwhelming consensus. There are disagreements in degree, but the consensus on the principles that I've laid out. We asked a number of questions. And by the way, we recognize how different all our states and cities are, how different the gun culture is, a healthy gun culture, in rural America than in urban America, how different the gun culture is in states which are overwhelming. My little state of Delaware, most of you probably won't realize it, we have one of the highest per capita gun ownerships of hunters in America because of duck hunting, because of all those magnificent tributaries that go from the Delaware Bay to the Chesapeake Bay, the Delaware River, and the various rivers that flow into the bay. It's a paradise for hunters. It's a big business as well as an institutional. It is cultural. I remember a woman named Miss Ann Messick from down in Kenton, Delaware. One of the reasons I got elected as a 29-year-old kid to the Senate. Saying, now, Joey, talk at me like this, and Dennis may remember Miss Ann Messick. She said, I want to show you something my daddy gave me. This is a woman who was 78 years old. She walks out in the backyard and says, you know, it is duck season now, right now. I mean, goose season. He said, you know that, so don't get mad. She walks into her den, takes a shotgun off over the fireplace. This woman almost 80 years old, and walks out and she said, my daddy told me how to steady aim, and I won a lot. Boom! Now, if you did that in, in the Upper East Side of, Manhattan, you got a problem. But it's really important, by the way, because some of you who share very strong feelings about gun control, I think it's important to understand it's part of the ethic of where a lot of us come from. But it's not this culture, the recognition of the differences in the cultural behavior and attitudes from Arizona to New Jersey. Although South Jersey, it's a big deal too, hunting. But my generic point here is recognizing those differences doesn't in any way negate the rational prospect of being able to come up with common sense approaches how to deal with the myriad of problems that relate to gun ownership. Who has that gun? So we asked a number of questions. The first question we ask is, who should be prohibited and who can legally be prohibited from owning a gun? Current law has evolved over time, and we've considered the question. My senior year in 1968 graduating was an incredible year. The only political career I ever had, Bobby Kennedy, was assassinated 2 days before I walked across the stage in graduation. Dr. King, the guy who got me engaged in politics, as Dennis and others in Delaware will tell you, was assassinated earlier in that year. Even had the assassination attempt at George Wallace. When I look back on 68, it's a wonder things held together, quite frankly. Well, the Congress passed what was then called the Gun Control Act. And among other things, it said that felons, fugitives, drug users, those who had been adjudicated, and it's not a politically correct phrase now, but it's in the law, those who'd been adjudicated mentally defective, is what the law says, could not lawfully own a gun. And then in 1994, as the world changed and the country changed, along with the thing I'm proudest of having written and passed, the Violence Against Women Act, we added a new category of people who were prohibited from purchasing a gun. based on facts, not based on fiction, not based on prejudice, and that is those who had a restraining order issued against them in a domestic violence incident. That was a fight to get that added. Then, 2 years later, we expanded the list again to include anyone convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violent crime because there was some history that they are the most likely people to do something that would not be untoward. Time and experience has demonstrated that we should continue to take a close look at the list to see if it fits the needs of society at the moment. As part of our recommendations to the President, I suggested that the President direct the Attorney General to study that question. Should any other people be added to the prohibited category? Should we look at a variety of categories? For example, right now, certain convicted stalkers can still purchase guns. People with outstanding warrants that capious out of the Philadelphia court, as long as they don't cross the line into Delaware, they can go get a gun. They cross the line into Delaware, then it's a fugitive warrant. They're outside the jurisdiction. People who have been convicted of misdemeanors for abusing their children are now prohibited, that added to the list. But as all of you know, you deal with it every day. There is parental abuse for elderly parents. Should they be prohibited? I'm not making a judgment, but I am convinced that we have to look at whether or not the prohibitive category should be expanded. And the most delicate area is in the mental health area, which requires a great deal of study. And ironically, this is where you find the pro-gun guys more inclined to prohibit more, and the anti-gun guys inclined to say, no, 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 it's privacy. But we have to look at it. We have to address it. These are just a few of the potential categories the President asked the Attorney General to look at. But there's a second issue involved here, and all of you know it. We have a thing called NICS, and that is the NICS system is in place in Washington, D.C. It runs the background checks on people before they can buy guns if they're in that prohibited class. And it's a little bit like if you ever bought a gun. I purchased I have two shotguns, a 20 gauge and a 12 gauge shotgun. You go and you get a background check. And it's a little bit like swiping your credit card in effect. It takes about that long. But just like when you check out your credit card, if the bank doesn't have on record exactly what you have in that account or not in that account, there you got a problem. Well, it's only as good as the information available, that NICS system. And right now, the information being put into that national system is woefully incomplete. States are supposed to make mental health records available for people who can't have guns, for example. But today, there are 17 states that have made fewer than 10 mental health records available on the background check system. 10. There are tens of thousands of felons, the estimate is, who are convicted in your cities and your states, that information never transmitted to the NICS system. So we recommended to the President that he redirect, because no one knows for sure whether or not it's an ideological judgment governors are making, not sending the material, or is it an economic issue. So we asked the President to redirect $20 million to the states to help them update those records and make them available. He's decided the Justice Department should do just that. But money only goes so far. A lot has to do with leadership. Again, I apologize for being parochial. I guess I'll always be a Senate guy and a Delaware guy, but I'm very proud of my home state. Because of the leadership of our governor, Jack Markell, with some help from a kid that I know pretty well as the Attorney General, Delaware has moved from one of the worst performing states to one of the best performing states as a consequence, at least as rated by the Mayors Against Gun Violence. It's about leadership. It's about making the decision to make this available. I know you folks have a lot of influence in your states. Well, that's not quite true. I have a bad habit of being straightforward. So the truth is, you don't have nearly as much influence as you should have in your states. Not because of you, but because of the way states work. But all kidding aside, I would ask you to continue to push your legislators, push the governors, to make these records available. And again, I'm not suggesting there's any nefarious reason why it's not being done, but it's not done. It's not done. And I'd also ask you to think about whether or not we should consider making the record sharing mandatory as a matter of law. Or do you think the idea that I proposed to the President of incentivizing states to provide the information is enough? We'd like to hear from you on that. And I will say one of the things we've learned is that the federal government hasn't been doing a very good job in the last 10 years either about sharing information available. So, on my recommendation, the President issued a directive, one of the executive orders that everybody got up in arms about, like he was going to rewrite the Constitution or something. One of the executive orders, he directed every federal agency to make sure that we, the federal government, live up to our end of the bargain to share all relevant information within the lawful possession of the federal government to that system if it contained people who should be disqualified as a matter of law. But once you figure out all those pieces, there's still another broader point, that a system that identifies people who should not only can't as a matter of law, but should not possess guns, only works if it actually prohibits those people from purchasing those guns. And so that's why we need, and I've recommended to the President, universal background checks. Studies show that up to 40% of the people, and there's no, let me be honest with you again, which I'll get to in a minute, but because of the lack of the ability of federal agencies to be able to even keep records, we can't say with absolute certainty what I'm about to say is correct. But the consensus is about 40% of the people who buy guns today do so outside the NICS system, outside the background check system. Right now, if someone purchases a gun from a licensed dealer, he's required to undergo this background check, which takes a matter of minutes. But he can buy that exact same gun from a private seller with no background check at all. That has to change. Think about it. It's like an airport. Imagine you get to the airport and there are two lines for security. One of them, you have to go through the metal detector, empty your pockets, take off your shoes, and the other one, you can go straight through to the plane. Where are you going to go? Especially if you're carrying something you're not supposed to. Which line do you think the terrorist picks? Well, the same thing about gun sales. Why would a criminal buy a gun at a store where he's required to go through a background check, or at a gun show from a licensed dealer where he's required to go through the background check, when he can buy a gun from the guy the next X over who sometimes has a sign above saying, no background check required? I won't get into the detail of why that's the case, because it's the definition of what constitutes a gun seller. Not only for profit, but how frequently you engage in it. I won't go through all that. So why wouldn't we do everything in our power to stop that? Whose rights being infringed on? The lawful citizen, the guy who has nothing to hide, or woman has nothing to hide, he goes through the system. Virtually no complaints. And even with an incomplete system, there have been almost 2 million convicted felons, adjudicated mentally incompetent, and the rest of the categories I've just mentioned denied the ability to legally buy a gun. So it makes no sense to me, especially since when I wrote the original assault weapons ban, there was a 12-day waiting period, then a 6-day waiting period, and then the NRA said something that I agreed with. They said, look, we won't object if you can do this quickly. So we invested a lot of time and money and effort in setting up this system. And by the way, I want to sell you my 12-gauge shotgun, which hadn't been used much lately. I want to sell you my shotgun, Mr. Mayor, in my home. It's not a big deal for you and I to say, look, we got to take another 20 minutes to go to Dick's Sporting Goods here, and they'll run the check for us. We pay them $10 to $12, and the check's done. It is an inconvenience, but it's not an inconvenience relative to the potential hole it may plug in the system. And we can make exceptions if I want to leave my guns to my son, Bo, who knows how to use them better than I. He's a better shot than I am. That's because he's a major in the Army, I guess. But my son Hunter's better too. Well, we may be able to write exceptions into handing down guns or giving guns to family members that your own gun. But there's no reason why we can't significantly broaden this to try to pick up that pool of roughly 40% of the people who buy a gun without any background check. The third question we ask is, what kinds of guns should be kept off our streets? Now, some purists in either end will say, wait a minute, you can take any gun you want off the street. Not true, in my view, under the Second Amendment. And others will say, you have no right to take anything off the street because, as Jefferson said, the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots. And a little out of context, but you hear it all the time. Well, guess what? No one doubts you're able to tell someone, even if you're a billionaire, you can't go buy an M1 tank with ordnance. You're not, I'm being deadly earnest, you know. You can't have a flamethrower. You can go. So it's been established. There is the ability to have legitimate limitations on the type of weapon that can be purchased. Toward that end, we looked at two issues. The definition of assault weapon and high-capacity magazines. And the president believes, I was going to say President I, it's relevant what he believes, the president believes that there should be, and I agree with him, new and stronger assault weapons ban. And I know, as well as anyone, having written the first assault weapons ban, that the industry will do whatever it can to get around it, and they'll figure out a way. We can define the stock, the scope, we can do a lot of things, but it can get around it. But I also know we have to try, or believe we have to try. But what I also know is that assault rifles aren't the only kind of gun that can accommodate a high-capacity magazine. Some of you are deer hunters, bear hunters, big game hunters. I'm not being facetious, I'm being literal. And you know, most of the weapons used, rifles used in that endeavor, can take clips that can accommodate 30, 40, 50. You don't, but they can accommodate it. So we recognize that the weapon of choice in your town also is not a rifle. The weapon of choice, and the vast majority of people are killed, or the handgun. But you can put an awful lot of rounds in a Glock and a lot of other handgun weapons. So we're calling for the prohibition of high-capacity magazines altogether. We can argue whether or not we're right at 10 or 12 or 7 or 9 or 15, but we know it makes no sense. Like we've learned since Columbine and Aurora and Newtown, police reach the scene in no time. You all have done incredible jobs. I mean it sincerely, I'm not being solicitous. Local officials have done incredible jobs in reducing the response times and the response by your police officers to crises. But high-capacity magazines leave victims with no chance, and all too often leave police outgunned as well. In Aurora, the assailant had a 100-clip magazine. Now, had his weapon not jammed, God knows how many more people would have been killed. I met with Gabby Gifford's husband, a national hero in his own right, Mark, the other day, and he's pointing out to me when Gabby was shot. You know this better than I do about Arizona. When Gabby was shot, but for the fact when the assailant had to put in a new clip and he fumbled putting a new clip in, and a woman reached out and jumped out and grabbed him, prevented him from putting a new clip in. The new congressman who was injured and shot with Gabby probably would not have been around to tell the story. So, in Newtown, some of those children were riddled with as many, it's hard to even say it, 11 bullet holes in a first grader. High-capacity magazines, in our view, are not worth the risk. And the notion high-capacity magazines don't have a practical sporting purpose or hunting purpose. As one hunter told me, if you got 12 rounds, it means you've already missed the deer 11 times. You should pack the sucker in at that point. You don't deserve to have a gun, period, if you're that bad. But seriously, think about it. Now, you'll hear, those of you who will agree with me, say, be prepared to say, well, look, for sporting at gun ranges, it makes sense. Well, I don't know why we can't say that those weapons should be kept at the range, if that's what they're for. I mean, decide, not pass a law, but make that judgment independently without in any way impacting on your sporting enjoyment. The next question we ask is, how do we make our streets and schools safer? With regard to our streets, I believe, and the President believes, that cops make a difference. I remember when I first wrote the cops bill, 100,000 Cop Street, I was told we've tried that before. We never tried that before. We never tried that before. And since, I should be clapping for you all, because it passed and you made it work. You made community policing work. Crime and violent crime went down because of you, the way you employed those additional police officers. That's why it went down. That's why it happened. And we still think, particularly in these economic difficult times for you all in municipalities, we want to provide state and local governments with the resources they need to keep cops on the street, even during hard economic times. And by the way, some of you smiled at me when Michael said, and Joe's going to make sure that these programs go, they go directly to the cities. And I went like that. Well, I tried that with the Recovery Act, and it didn't work. But I tried it with cops, and it worked. Cops, it works. That's how it should work. But here's the deal. If you don't think you should find yourself in a position of having to cut funding for law enforcement in order to pay for some other essential service, we think that you would agree with us that we're going to come back at it again, and we've gone through OMB. We're going to push again for another $4 billion in grants for the COPS program. Now, it's important. But here's the deal. Thank you. I don't want anybody confusing that with the argument that every school in America should have armed guards and armed teachers and armed principals and the like. In the original COPS bill, as I wrote it, as we wrote it, there was a provision for school resource officers. Now, I admit to you, when I wrote it in the first time, I wasn't thinking of mass shootings. But what I was thinking about was the same principle as community policing. The reason why community policing works is you get your local law enforcement officers acquainted with and accommodated in the neighborhood where they build trust. And so Mrs. Jones in the corner, who's watching that drug deal go down every night and seeing shootings and having her window blown out a couple times, she's not going to pick up the phone and cold call City Hall. She's afraid. But if she's gotten a relationship with the local cop, she'll say, Charlie, don't say me, but let me tell you what's happening in my corner. Well, the same thing happened with school resource officers. Because what happens is they stand in a school, armed or unarmed, uniformed, and guess what? The kids get to know them, and they think it's cool talking to them, and they get to, it's like talking to your coach. And what we found out, kids say things like, John, when I opened my locker this morning, 3 lockers down, 47, there was a handle of a gun sticking out. Or John, don't say anything, but there's a drug deal going to go down in the back of the gym today. Or John, there's going to be a rumble and da-da-da. That's why they were. Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to propose. We believe school resource officers can play an important role, but that you should have significantly more flexibility in how to use them. That's why we're proposing a new school safety program that funds officers, but also gives your communities the flexibility to apply up for other support. So a school resource officer is going to cost you X thousands of dollars a year with the money the federal government's putting up. You can say, no, we'd rather have a school psychologist, or we want a school resource officer who's unarmed. But what we don't want, the president and I, we don't want rent-a-cops in schools armed. We don't want people in schools who aren't trained like police officers. And we're not even insisting schools use police officers for that. If they conclude they need a school psychiatrist versus a school resource officer, you can apply for the funding that would otherwise come from that for that purpose. We also make sure that every school has a reliable emergency response plan. I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this. You have no idea how many, literally, school districts from all across the country and your states have picked the phone and called my office and said, can you tell us what the best plan is if something like this happens? The Department of Education has been inundated. So one of the few things that the federal government historically can do well, since we have more resources, is figure out what best practices are. By going all around the country, taking the information we have from you all, deciding on what best practices are, and saying when, and then going out and saying, look, Congress has funded the creation of these plans. School districts who want to take advantage of them, here they are. Here's what we found worked in rural areas, urban areas, whatever. But we're asking the Congress to fund safety implementation programs. The next question that we asked was, how can we improve access to mental health services so that people get the help they need before it's too late? We looked at the circumstances when people age out of Medicaid. You know what's happens in your cities. You got these kids get on mental health services. All of a sudden they age out and there's nothing there. There's nothing they can do. The social worker, or a social worker like my daughter, who when she worked for the state, now she works for a nonprofit. But all of a sudden, your dad, what are we going to do? This kid still needs help. He's aged out. Well, we're calling on Congress to help those who deal with children every day to look for the warning signs that refer kids to treatment. It turns out that 3/4 of all mental illness appears by age 24, but less than half the children with diagnosable mental health problems ever receive any treatment. We need to change that. And I'm proud to say we're already positioned, better than we ever have in the history of the country, to make great progress in this because of the Affordable Care Act. It fully kicks in next year. And because of the leadership of Republican Senator Domenici and Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy on mental health parity. We've got to get this nation to the point, and that's where we're going to speak to this in a second, where in fact a mental health problem receives the same credibility and coverage with a physician or a psychiatrist as somebody who breaks their arm. And by the way, parenthetically, as my son, who's an Iraq veteran, can tell you, as Attorney General, as he's had to deal with this, we got a lot of women and men coming home with invisible injuries. We have over 40,000 visible injuries. Over 19,000 are going to require help the rest of their lives. My wife and I spent all last night at Walter Reed meeting with the only good news is the number of amputees that are on the floor now is down. Spending the whole night with these kids who are double amputees, some triple amputees. But there's another category of people. We don't know the number, but we know it's significant, with traumatic brain injury, the invisible disease, the invisible wound, with post-traumatic stress. Bo would be mad at me if I gave an example of a case he has to deal with because I don't know, but you know, there's a lot of veterans coming home, having trouble. The suicide rate is astounding. Almost one a day. Almost one a day. Because there's not sufficient mental health capacity in the system. And we're doing everything to go out and hire 78,000 new folks for VA and the like. But the point is, we've got to deal with this. And so the question we asked was how to do that. And that's going to take more time, but we have concrete answers we'll make available to you, what we think, how to begin this process. And the next question, folks, we asked was, how do you prevent gun trafficking, the bane of the existence of 7 of the biggest cities in America and a lot of other people? And it starts with the obvious proposition, creating a federal trafficking statute for guns. We have one for drugs, but there is no federal trafficking statute. As you all pointed out to us, a substantial percentage of the gun crimes committed in your towns are committed with weapons purchased outside your state or your city. In Illinois, for example, 47% of the guns recovered at crime scenes were purchased outside the state. In New York, it's 68%. The only way to stop this is with the federal trafficking statute. So we recommended to the president that he call on Congress to pass a statute, and he agreed. Some of those guns are bought by straw purchasers, people who pass the required background checks to buy weapons for others. Maybe they give them to a middleman who transport them from Florida to New York or from one state to another, but there isn't an explicit law against straw purchasing. And so straw purchasers and others who traffic in guns are often out of the prosecuted patchwork or paperwork, and the only way you pick them up is to make a paperwork violation. And you know as well as I do how many guns are unaccounted for because they were straw purchased. We need strong federal laws that help us attack the entire trafficking network. And finally, and I know I've taken a long time, but this is something so many of you have spent a lot of time talking to me about, and I wanted to give it to you straight here. We ask, what can we do better about understanding gun violence? As some of you know, when the crime bill I authored in '94 expired including the assault weapons ban in 2004, one of the things we were able to do back then in '94 was write legislation that allowed us to gather a considerable amount of information. The CDC was able to, the Center for Disease Control was able to conduct research on gun violence. So we could figure out some basic things about its causes and its uses. Well, not only did the Congress not review the assault weapons ban in 2004, it also put significant impediments on federal agencies who were doing basic research and explicitly prohibited. CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is prohibited by federal law from doing any research. And there's a whole set of amendments that were added called the Triard Amendments that further constrain the ability to gather data. We need answers to a lot of questions. We need better understanding of the causes. We need longer-term independent studies to determine, for example, not only the impact of guns and how people die and what type of guns and so on and so forth. We need studies, and this is where the entertainment industry doesn't like me at all. We need studies on what are the impacts on young minds of witnessing repetitive violent acts, either in movies or on television or in video games. That's not an indictment of the industry. It's a recognition we have no extensive modern studies on these things. It's worth pointing out from my conversations with these industries, they seem intent on doing what they can do to help. They've got a rating system, parental controls, and other tools that the vast majority of Americans don't even know. I don't know whether you know. If you have Infinity, you can go on, if your grandchild or child watches those early morning cartoons on Saturday that have excessive violence in them, they're just cartoons, right? You can actually program your television to take out extreme violence, moderate violence, violence. You can do it now. 90% of the parents, I don't think, have any idea of that. So one of the things I said is they should be going on a major advertising campaign to let people know. But quite frankly, we don't have sufficient data. And it seems to me, as an informed society, we need data. So the president signed a directive that allows the CDC to begin gathering that information again. And I think that's a very important step. So let me conclude by saying, once again, thank you. Thank you for not only all you did to contribute to this report, but thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come and be as explicit and long and hopefully not, but possibly boring in laying out to you the elements of what we believe we have to look at. And let me acknowledge the truth, that too many in this country have been silent too long. We cannot be silent any longer. Those 20 beautiful children who lost their lives in Newtown are no longer able to speak for themselves. We have to speak for them. 900 people who lost their lives on the city streets of your cities to gun violence since Newtown 33 days ago, 4 now I guess it is, are not able to speak for themselves. We got to speak for them. Those more than 9,000 lives lost to gun violence in our city each year are no longer able to speak for themselves. Somebody's got to speak for them. And there are some who say the most powerful voice in this debate belongs to the gun lobbies and those who demand the stop to these common sense approaches to save lives. I think they're wrong. This time will not be like times that have come before. Newtown has shocked the nation. The carnage on our streets is no longer able to be ignored. We're going to take this fight to the halls of Congress. We're going to take it beyond that. We're going to take it to the American people. We're going to go around the country making our case, and we're going to let the voices of the American people be heard. And we will be criticized because people will say if we're spending that much energy, we're not spending enough energy on immigration. We're not spending enough energy on the fiscal problem. We're not spending. Look, folks, presidents don't get to choose what they deal with. They deal with what is before them and then what they'd like to long term. All these things interrelate. I once asked former Mayor Daley of Chicago, I said back in the late, I guess early 90s, I said, Mayor, if there's anything I could do for you, what would you do? He said, get rid of the drug problem. It would save, it would transform the economy of my city overnight. Well, gun violence falls in a similar category. If we speak for those who we lost, if we speak for our children and our families, if we have the courage to do what we know is the right thing to do, then we'll have the most powerful voice. And we, you, our citizens, will change the nation. I've been in this fight a long time. I have no illusions about the fight that's in front of us. I have no illusions about distortions that will come from all sides. But I know full well the political obstacles that will be thrown up against us are not impenetrable. I have no illusions about how hard it's going to be, but I know this: we have no choice. We will not be able to look our kids and our grandkids in the eye if we don't use every energy, every bit of energy, every fiber in our being to try to keep them safer. Will not be worthy of the generation that's going to grow up now without those 20 innocent kids and those thousands of people already lost. Will not be able to stop every act of senseless gun violence or any other kind of violence. We know that in the future. But that's no excuse to do nothing. That is not an excuse to do nothing. As the president said, if we can save even one life, it's worth it. I believe together we can save a whole lot more lives than that. And I think we can begin again, not because of guns alone, but I think we can begin an endeavor that stops the coursing of American culture and society. I think we can begin to turn this around. It's not all because of guns. It's a lot of other things. But maybe what happened in Newtown is a call to action about more than just gun violence, about civility in our society. I thank you all. You all are in the front lines. May God bless you, and may God bless the memory of the victims of Newtown and all those others who've fallen as a consequence of this senseless violence. And thank you for your time.
That concludes lunch, and we still have the rest of the activities in your daily schedule. Thank you so much.